The stage hand was shaking. That was the first thing Ed McMahon noticed. The young NBC stagehand who was supposed to will the boy onto the Tonight Show stage on the night of March 14, 1974, had both hands locked on the wheelchair grips and his knuckles had gone completely white. He had been working at NBC Burbank for 3 years. He had pushed carts carrying full orchestra equipment. He had maneuvered cameras through crowded hallways. He had done his job quietly and invisibly, the way good stagehands do. But tonight, his hands would not stop shaking. Because tonight, the chair he was pushing was not carrying equipment. It was carrying a 7-year-old boy named Danny Holloway, who weighed 41 pounds, whose head was wrapped in a brown patterned bandana, and whose small hands rested flat on his knees with the stillness of someone who had learned to carry very big things inside a very small body. The show was live. 11 million Americans were watching. Elvis Presley was seated in the guest chair in a white gold-trimmed jumpsuit, mid-sentence, mid-laugh, at the absolute peak of his fame and his power. And he had no idea what was about to walk through that curtain and change him forever. For a moment, no one moved. The wheelchair reached the edge of the stage. The stagehand stopped. Danny Holloway looked out at the studio, at the lights, at the audience, at the most famous entertainer alive sitting 10 feet away. And he did not flinch. Elvis saw the boy before Carson did. His sentence stopped the way a flame stops when the air leaves the room. Not a trail off, not a pause. A stop. He stood up from the guest chair without thinking, the way a person stands when something inside them demands it. The audience went silent so completely that the hum of the studio lighting became audible. Johnny Carson rose from behind his desk. And then Danny Holloway reached into the front pocket of his jeans, unfolded a small piece of paper he had been carrying for 3 weeks, and looked directly at Elvis Presley and spoke. What he said in the next 4 seconds would drop the king of rock and roll to the floor of a live television stage, and would be whispered about, wept over, and replayed for the next 50 years. But that moment didn't start there. It started 6 weeks earlier in a children's hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, in a room where a boy who was running out of time had decided to spend what he had left on someone else. If you've never heard this story, stay with me, because what this 7-year-old boy understood about Elvis Presley, that the whole world had missed, is something that will stay with you long after this video ends. And if you've already subscribed, share this one. The people in your life who need it will thank you. Ward C of St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, did not look like a place where remarkable things happened. It looked like what it was: a long corridor of small rooms with pale green walls, fluorescent lights that hummed slightly off-key, and a smell of antiseptic so familiar to the staff that they had stopped noticing it years ago. The nurses on the overnight shift called it the quiet ward. Not because the children there were quiet. Many of them were not. But because the adults who walked those halls had learned to speak in a particular register, calm and steady and unhurried, the way you speak when you are trying not to let fear travel through your voice into someone else. Room 14 was the third door on the left. Danny Holloway had been in it for 11 days when February arrived, recovering from his second round of chemotherapy. And the chart on his door listed his age as 7, his diagnosis as acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and his prognosis in language that his mother Carol had asked the doctor to explain 3 times before she believed she had understood it correctly. Danny himself was not reading his chart. Danny was telling jokes. He had a spiral notebook on his bedside table, a green one with a football on the cover, and inside it he had written down every joke he had collected since he was 5 years old. Knock-knock jokes, riddles, things he had overheard adults say that made other adults laugh, even though he was not entirely sure why. He told them to the nurses who changed his 4. He told them to the boy in room 12 who spoke no English and understood the punchlines anyway, because Danny delivered them with his whole face. He told them to his mother every morning when she arrived, still wearing her coat, her eyes carrying the specific exhaustion of a woman who had been praying in a hospital parking lot before coming inside. Carol Holloway was a seamstress from Tupelo, Mississippi. She was 31 years old. She had been strong for so long that she could no longer clearly remember what it felt like not to be. Every night after Danny fell asleep, she sat in the chair beside his bed and listened to the record turning on the small turntable his father had brought from home. Elvis Presley, How Great Thou Art, the gospel album, playing softly in room 14 while her son slept and the corridor outside stayed quiet and the night moved slowly toward morning. Carol Holloway wrote the letter on a Tuesday night in late January after Danny had fallen asleep and the record had finished its last side and the room was quiet enough that she could hear her own breathing. She did not write it to Elvis's management company. She did not write it to Colonel Tom Parker's office or to RCA Records or to any of the official addresses printed inside album sleeves. She wrote it to Elvis Presley, Graceland, Memphis, Tennessee, and she trusted that it would find him the way you trust something when you have run out of more logical options. She did not ask for a concert ticket. She did not ask for an autograph or a photograph or a meet and greet or any of the things that fan letters typically requested. She wrote 3 paragraphs. In the first, she described Danny, not his illness but him. The joke notebook, the way he learned the names of every nurse, the way he comforted the boy in room 12 who couldn't understand his words but laughed anyway. In the second paragraph, she described the record. How Danny had heard How Great Thou Art once at his grandmother's house and demanded his own copy. How it had become the thing that ended every night in room 14, the last sound before sleep, the voice that made the dark feel smaller. In the third paragraph, she wrote 1 sentence. She wrote, I just wanted the man who made that record to know that his voice is the reason my son is not afraid. She sealed the envelope on a Wednesday morning and mailed it from the post office 2 blocks from the hospital. She did not expect a response. She told herself she did not expect a response. Elvis Presley's personal secretary, Mildred Hubbard, received it 10 days later. Mildred had worked at Graceland since 1965 and she had her own private system for the mail. A system she had never described to Colonel Parker and never intended to. Letters from hospitals went into a separate pile on the corner of her desk. She read every one personally. Most received a signed photograph and a handwritten note from her, warm and careful, signed with Elvis's name. But Carol Holloway's letter, she carried upstairs and placed directly on Elvis's breakfast tray on a Thursday morning in February. She did not explain why. She simply put it there. And Elvis read it once, pushed his breakfast aside, and read it again. By that afternoon, he had picked up the phone and he was not calling Colonel Parker. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now because what Elvis did next is the part of this story that almost nobody knows. Elvis Presley arrived at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital on a Thursday morning in February 1974 with no photographers, no publicist, no advanced press release, and no entourage beyond his cousin Gene Smith, who drove him there in an unmarked car. Colonel Tom Parker did not know. Elvis had not told him. He had not told anyone except Mildred, who had made 1 quiet phone call to the hospital administrator the evening before to arrange access. The staff had been asked not to alert the press. Every single one of them kept that promise. Elvis walked through the entrance of Ward C in a plain dark jacket. No jewelry, no stage presence. Nothing that announced him except his face. And even that he kept low, unhurried, moving the way a person moves when they are trying to arrive somewhere rather than be seen arriving. He spent 4 hours on that ward. He sat beside 17 different children. He did not perform. He did not pose. He sang when a child asked him to, quietly, without a microphone, leaning close so the music went directly to the person it was meant for and nowhere else. A nurse who was present that morning would say years later that watching Elvis Presley sing to a 6-year-old girl in a hospital bed was the most purely human thing she had ever seen a famous person do, because he was not doing it for anyone watching. He did not know she was watching. He thought he was alone with the child. When he reached room 14, he knocked on the open door, the way you knock when you want to give someone the choice to let you in. Danny Holloway looked up from his joke notebook. He studied Elvis for a moment with the frank, unhurried assessment that only very young children and very old people deploy without embarrassment. Then he said, with complete 7-year-old seriousness, "You're taller than I thought." Elvis sat down in the chair beside the bed, Carol's chair, the one she occupied every night, and said, "You're funnier than I thought." Danny showed him the joke notebook. Elvis read 4 jokes and laughed genuinely at 2 of them, which Danny recorded as a professional victory. They talked for 40 minutes. When Elvis stood to leave, Danny looked up at him and said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Are you scared of anything?" Elvis looked at the boy. He opened his mouth. He closed it again. He said, "More than you'd think, son." Danny nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. That answer stayed with him. He thought about it every day for the next 3 weeks. He thought about it so carefully and so seriously that he eventually picked up a pen, tore a page from the back of his joke notebook, and began to write. The Tonight Show producer who called Carol Holloway on a Monday morning in early March was a man named Richard Galvin, and he had a proposition that he delivered carefully in the measured tone of someone who understood he was handling something fragile. Elvis Presley was already booked on The Tonight Show for March 14th. The segment was locked, the publicity was done, the logistics were set. But Galvin had heard through a St. Jude staff member about the unannounced visit, about the man in the plain dark jacket who had spent 4 hours on Ward C without a single camera present. And he had an idea. Would Carol and Danny come to Burbank as surprise guests? The segment would be brief, completely in the family's control. If Danny felt unwell, if anything felt wrong at any moment, they would stop. Carol said yes before he finished the sentence. She did not tell Danny immediately. She waited until that evening, after the record had finished its last side and the room was quiet, and then she told him simply that they were going to California to see Elvis on television. Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he reached under his pillow and pulled out the folded piece of paper he had been keeping there for 11 days. He had written on it, crossed things out, rewritten them, folded and unfolded it so many times that the creases had gone soft. He read it once more to himself, lips moving slightly. Then he folded it and held it in both hands and said, "Good. I have something to tell him." Carol did not ask what it said. She would say later that she did not ask because some part of her already knew that whatever was written on that paper was between Danny and Elvis, and that her job was simply to get her son to the place where he could deliver it. They flew to Burbank on March 13th, the day before the taping. A car met them at the airport. Danny slept the entire flight with the folded paper in his jacket pocket. At the NBC studio the following evening, while stagehands moved around them and the audience filed into seats and the band ran through its warm-up, Danny sat in the green room in his wheelchair with his hands in his lap and his joke notebook on his knees and the paper in his pocket and said almost nothing. Carol sat beside him. She held his hand. She did not cry. She had decided on the flight over that tonight she was not going to be the mother who was afraid. Tonight she was going to be the mother of someone brave. When the stagehand appeared at the green room door and said quietly, "We're ready for him," Danny looked up at his mother and smiled. The same smile he used when he was about to deliver a punchline he was genuinely proud of. Carol squeezed his hand once. The stagehand took the wheelchair grips and the door opened into the brightness of the corridor that led to the stage. If the story is hitting you the way it's hitting me, subscribe right now and share it because the next 60 seconds of what happened on that stage is something television has never forgotten. The studio was warm, the way television studios are always warm. Too many lights, too many bodies, the air carrying the particular electricity of something live and uncontrollable. Elvis was mid-story when the wheelchair came through the curtain. Something about a Memphis restaurant and a case of mistaken identity, and Carson was laughing his big open laugh and the audience was loose and happy and completely unprepared for what was about to enter the room. Elvis saw Danny before Carson did. Before the audience did. Before the cameras had swung to capture it. He saw the wheelchair and the small boy in it and the brown bandana and the 41 pounds of someone who had used up a great deal of himself just getting to this room. And his sentence stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. He stood up from the guest chair the way a person stands when their body makes the decision before their mind does. And he walked to the edge of the stage and crouched down to Danny's eye level. And for a moment the two of them simply looked at each other. The audience had gone so quiet that the band members, still holding their instruments, did not move. Carson had risen from behind his desk. Ed McMahon would say afterward that in 23 years beside Johnny Carson, he had never seen that expression on his face. Not performance, not composure, but something unguarded and completely real. Danny reached into his pocket. He unfolded the paper slowly, the soft creases opening for the last time, and he held it in both hands and looked at it once. Then he looked up at Elvis, and he read. His voice was steady and clear and carried further than anyone expected from a body that small. He said, "Mr. Presley, you came to see me when you didn't have to. You sang to me when nobody was watching. I want you to know that I'm not scared anymore. And I think you should know that because I think maybe you are." The studio held its breath for 4 full seconds. Elvis Presley's face moved through something that had no single name. Recognition, exposure, grief, gratitude, all of it arriving at once, too fast to manage or perform or redirect. He sat down on the stage floor. He put his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. The king of rock and roll in his white gold-trimmed jumpsuit under 11 million watts of television lighting wept without restraint in front of 11 million people because a 7-year-old boy with a joke notebook and a torn piece of paper had seen him more clearly than anyone had in years. Danny Holloway reached out his small hand and placed it gently on top of Elvis's head. And the audience, every single person in that studio, understood that they were not watching a television segment anymore. They were watching something true. Danny Holloway died on November 3, 1974. He was 7 years old and 11 months. He did not make it to 8. Carol kept everything, the phone calls from Graceland, the signed copy of How Great Thou Art that arrived by mail in September with a note in Elvis's handwriting that said simply, "For the boy who is not afraid." She kept the torn piece of notebook paper framed on her wall in Tupelo for the next 40 years. Elvis Presley died on August 16, 1977. He was 42. In the weeks after his death, as the world lined up to describe the darkness of his final years, Carol Holloway wrote one letter to the Memphis Commercial Appeal. She did not write about the fame or the collapse or the legend. She wrote about the man who arrived at Ward C without photographers and sang to children who had no idea he owed them nothing. That letter was reprinted in 17 newspapers. People who read it said it was the truest thing written about Elvis after he was gone. Between March 1974 and August 1977, Elvis made 17 more unannounced hospital visits. No cameras, no Colonel Parker, no press. When he died, the Tonight Show notepad with Danny's ward number still written on it was found in the drawer of his bedside table at Graceland. Some things do not need an audience to be real. A dying child looked at the most famous man in the world and told him the truth. Not to wound him, but because he had enough courage left over to spend some of it on someone else. That is the whole story, and it is enough. If this moved you, please subscribe, hit like, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Tell us in the comments what would you have said.